Get started as latecomers join us. Thank you all very much for joining us today on this very nice afternoon in Glasgow, at least. This is our final webinar at the Glasgow Centre for International Law and Security this semester. This event is also part of our research project, Endless Conflicts, that we are working on with Giedre Jokubauskaite and Eloise at Glasgow, and in collaboration with our German partners from the Freie Universität in Berlin. And I can see some of our German colleagues in the audience as well. Thank you for joining. I would like to give some information about the project before I introduce our speakers today, as this will help to also contextualize the event today. In this project, we are looking at the so-called triple nexus, the nexus of humanitarian, development and peace objectives in situations of protracted conflict. We are looking at how these three fields of action and objectives can be rethought in a more integrated and complementary manner. What are the opportunities, what are the possibilities, and what are some of the potential pitfalls? This is required, this rethinking, as conflicts have become increasingly protracted. The conflicts in Syria and Yemen are just only a couple of examples. And these conflicts have socioeconomic and environmental dimensions as their root causes. They lead to socioeconomic and environmental consequences, severe consequences, ranging from environmental degradation to damage to infrastructure and urban services, from food security to the governance of natural resources. So thinking about the socioeconomic and environmental dimensions of conflict and peace is essential for building sustainable peace and achieving sustainable development. We have three distinguished speakers today that will look at the different dimensions of the socioeconomic and environmental considerations at play in situations of conflict and peace. Our first speaker is Carl Bruch. Carl is a senior attorney and director of international programs at the Environmental Law Institute. He is also the director of the Environmental Peacebuilding Association. He's a leading authority on the means to manage natural resources to support post-conflict peacebuilding, and in general on environmental governance and institutions. Our second speaker is Brian Lender. Brian is the Deputy Director of the World Food Programme. You may remember that the World Food Programme won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2020 for its contribution to bettering conditions for peace in conflict-affected areas with their work on hunger as a weapon of war and conflict. Brian also has extensive experience in the humanitarian sector beyond working at the WFP. He's worked with the UN High Commissioner for Refugees in the past. Our final third speaker today is Amanda Cahill-Ripley. She's a senior lecturer in law at the University of Liverpool. She's an expert in international human rights law with a focus on economic, social, and cultural rights. She's been working on and leading a project on economic, social, and cultural rights and sustaining peace. She's worked with UN bodies and the Northern Ireland Assembly as part of that project, and she has a forthcoming monograph on the same topic with Cambridge University Press. Just to go through the format quickly and the technicalities of webinars, I'm sure you're all familiar with this by now, but each speaker will have 10 to 15 minutes for their talks. As Carl has to leave us a bit early to join another meeting that he has to be at, he's the first speaker, so we'll take questions for him after his talk, but then we'll continue with Brian and Amanda and have a general discussion at the end. For your questions, please feel free to submit them throughout the talks using the chat function if you prefer doing that. Eloise is going to monitor the chat and she'll gather questions. If you prefer asking your question at the end yourself, please raise your hand. Your virtual hand is available under the Reactions tab at the bottom of your Zoom screen. As I mentioned, as Carl will leave early, please do send your questions for him early on, right away, or just raise your hand after he finishes his talk. Thank you so much again. The floor is yours, Carl.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here, and I'm glad to have the chance to share some of my reflections on this, because your work on endless conflicts reflects a changing nature of conflict and the role of environment in that. And international law is slow to catch up to that, to those changes. I'm going to talk broadly about environmental peace building, what it is, and then talk a little bit about the international law foundations for this. And I'm delighted to see among the participants people like Daniela and Amanda, who have their own extensive knowledge of this coming from different perspectives. One of the things that I think is so great about this is that we're talking about international law and not just international humanitarian law. So environmental peace building is the process of governing and managing natural resources and the environment to support durable peace. This is across the conflict life cycle, before, during, and after. It involves renewable resources, non-renewable resources, ecosystems and their services. It works at the international level, at the national level, and at the local level. Although I would posit that while the dynamics are often similar, that there are particularities of scale and of the particular environmental or natural resource dimensions. And it applies not only to violent conflict or armed conflict, but also to social conflict. And I think this is where life gets very interesting, because with endless conflicts, we're looking at the changing nature of conflict. And I come to environmental peace building having spent several years focusing on post-conflict peace building. But situations are very fluid. It's not always easy to say, is this post-conflict? Is it pre-conflict? Is Colombia in conflict? Well, it depends where in Colombia you are. So it's very, the world is much more nuanced and complex than our international legal frameworks often account for. This is a figure that we developed with UNEP, particularly David Jensen, that highlights the connections. So this is essentially the conflict life cycle, before, during, after. At the top, we see the risks. These are the things that most people often focus on. Environment as a contributing cause of conflict, helping to finance conflict, conflict resources, targeting of the environment during conflict, incentive for peace spoilers, especially around natural resources, and illegal trade and exploitation. Those are the risks. At the same time, we see all sorts of opportunities. Good resource governance as a way of trying to prevent conflict. An entry point for dialogue. Provision of employment and livelihoods, food security, economic recovery after conflict. And so it's important to kind of see this in a more integrated way, because historically, we've been very compartmentalized. This agency has this mandate to do these things to prevent conflict. This agency or this institution has this mandate under this law to try to reduce the suffering and harm from conflict. This other institution is working on ending conflict. But these things are so, in reality, they're integrated. And we need to be looking in a more holistic and integrated way at these issues. I also want to note that, if you look at this, look at it this way, you think, environmental peace building is, consists of the environmental dimensions of peace and conflict. And that is partially true. But it also looks at the security dimensions of sustainable development, issues of conflict-sensitive programming. How can, if you're trying to save the environment, you're trying to stop climate change, environmental people often have a blind spot when it comes to the potential social impacts. And this can generate conflict, ironically. And so you see a growing number of institutions that are trying to think about, how do we not exacerbate or even generate conflict in the first place? And the Sustainable Development Goals, we looked at the relationship between the SDGs and environmental peace building. And you'll see here the arrows going two ways. And the percentages are the percentage of targets within that particular goal, where environmental peace building affects the ability or supports the supports that target, or where the target supports environmental peace building. It's not everything relates to environmental peace building, but what you see is that all of the goals do have a dimension that tie in to environmental peace building. Both are supported by environmental peace building and support environmental peace building. Shifting to the international law foundations of environmental peace building, I'd like to start with essentially two premises, both coming from the International Law Commission. First of all, treaties that are not law of war treaties, they're not international humanitarian law. There may be international environmental law, international human rights law, different non-IHL treaties continue to apply during armed conflict. So when we talk about protection of the environment in relation to armed conflict, we should not be talking only about IHL. Secondly, we need to view international law as a system to be implemented in a coherent manner. Simply because one is complying with one provision in or one body of law does not mean that one is in compliance with international law. And so we need to be looking for today's discussion, we need to be looking, yes, at IHL, but also at international human rights law, international criminal law, international environmental law, international trade law, especially when it comes to conflict resources, and the UN Charter, among others. In terms of post-conflict peace building, the Secretary General has had a series of reports on peace building in the immediate aftermath of conflict. This is the 2 years immediately after conflict. And those reports consistently highlight 4 or 5 areas, depends on how you cluster them. But they consistently highlight a series of areas. And these are not based on theory. This is based on what they're seeing on the ground. This is driven by what is needed and what actually happens. First is security, the demobilization, disarmament, and reintegration of ex-combatants, security sector reform, peacekeeping, mine action. So all of those trying to create a safe and secure environment. Second are basic services, delivery of water, sanitation, energy, economic recovery, livelihoods. Sometimes economic recovery and livelihoods are clustered, sometimes they're disaggregated, and inclusive governance and cooperation. All of these have environmental inputs, and they all take place in environmental contexts. So post-conflict peace building, pretty much most of the objectives, certainly at the top level, they all have environmental dimensions. And many of the elements of these areas of focus, the specific areas of focus also have environmental dimensions. The question for today's discussion is, so what's the role of international law here? A lot of this stuff there's a lot of stuff happening on the ground. Organizations are doing things. Where are the international lawyers? Well, a few thoughts on that. First of all, international law provides structuring rules. It provides mandates in peacekeeping, in what peacekeepers are supposed to do, whether they're supposed to be focusing on protecting oil pipelines in Abyei or monitoring disputes over diamonds or land. Increasingly, we see peacekeeping mandates providing a general focus on specific natural resource dynamics. Through the UN Charter and Security Council resolutions that bind member states, we see a lot of efforts to try to address conflict resources, natural resources that finance armed conflict. Since 1990, more than 35 different major armed conflicts, those are conflicts with more than 1,000 battle deaths, have been financed with some form of natural resources. Diamonds, timber, bananas, marble, coca, opium poppy, literally any natural resource that provides a revenue stream that rebels can tap into to finance. Human rights. We see on the gender side, we see it from minorities, we see in terms of environmental defenders that human rights often provide important guideposts in what is often a tumultuous and insecure transition. And international environmental law. In a lot of countries, especially after conflict, we see efforts to revise laws, to make them more transparent and participatory, to make institutions more accountable. All of this is coming straight out of international environmental law, complemented by international human rights law. Focus on environmental defenders, and even increasingly the rights of nature. In Colombia, we're seeing the rights of rivers and forests and ecosystems as part of the transitional justice process. The other part that is important here is that international law recognizes national sovereignty. And this, I think, is an important countervailing force that moderates the direct application of a lot of international law. And so in practice, we see national law and national practice often being more dominant. Even when international organizations are actively involved, it's really about, so what should the law say, or how should, how do we build the case on this? It's much more local, much more domestic oriented. So we do see that a lot of on the ground work is happening around natural resources, especially after conflict, and that is informing the ongoing codification and progressive development of international law, as we've seen on the International Law Commission's work on protection of the environment in relation to armed conflict. I want to highlight a few other areas that international law, or a few other roles that international law plays, particularly in post-conflict peace building. And one is around cooperation and engagement, that especially where there's been a prolonged conflict and countries have turned inward to address those conflicts, we see after the end of conflict, the country seeks to rejoin the international community, to re-engage in a more constructive way as it's able to, it needs to manage shared waters or shared ecosystems. And so you see Afghanistan and Iraq and others joining international conventions that they had not been in a position to focus on. And with that comes technical assistance and financing to help implement. We also see mechanisms for accountability, some of it through international criminal law, some of it through international human rights law, and occasionally through international humanitarian law. And there are standards and processes that international law can inform how things are done. I'm thinking here specifically about the UN Compensation Commission that was set up to adjudicate claims against Iraq after the 1990-91 Gulf War, and questions of assessing the natural resource damages and valuing them came from international environmental law and domestic environmental law. Finally, for those who are interested in these issues, I would encourage you to check out the Environmental Peacebuilding Association. This is a multidisciplinary forum to address issues related to conflict, peace, and the environment. We foster knowledge development and exchange, build capacity and awareness, and strengthen relationships between scholars, practitioners, and decision makers. Our second International Conference on Environmental Peace Building will be held February 2nd through 4th, 2022 in Geneva. And if you go to environmentalpeacebuilding.org, you can get more information on that. With that, I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Carl, for this very comprehensive overview. For the questions as it is posted, please feel free to submit them in writing via the chat or just raise your virtual hand. Gidre, would you like to go ahead?
Nice comprehensive opening, I think, to directly answering the question of what is the role for international law. So I just wanted to ask you maybe to say a little bit more about the localization agenda. That is something that we have discussed a little bit earlier. And what do you think is the role for international law, in addition to all of these more structural features that it plays in, if at all, in helping the localization agenda or in helping more, I don't know, giving more agency to the local actors in peace building processes? Thanks.
Ashley, would you like me to take a couple or respond individually?
I think you can go ahead, Carl,
Okay.
and then we'll collect questions.
So very good question. One of the things that we see is that historically environmental peace building focused very much on top down. And what we're seeing now after several years of work in the field, that the top down, it's sometimes hard to see the impacts. It's necessary, certainly theoretically, and I think it is necessary, but often one can see impacts and you can see actual value at the local level. And so there's this question of top down, bottom up, how do they relate to one another? And I think this is a big question that environmental peace building is exploring right now. In practice, I think that what often happens is that to the extent that international law is relevant at the local level, some of it is around the normative approaches, so transparency, participation, gender equality, and that often will drive particular approaches or inform how they are designed. There are sometimes also in the opportunities that I mentioned. So if you talk about community management of wetlands, that might be tied to funding associated with the Ramsar Convention. So, or to Convention on Biological Diversity or Global Environment Facility funding. The GEF funds in a lot of fragile and conflict-affected countries. And this is for implementation of international environmental agreements. So a lot of those, it's first of all, it's rare to find an international lawyer when you're in the field in Liberia or South Sudan or wherever. Maybe in the capital you'll find a couple people who have focused on it, but in the field it's not there. Doesn't mean that it doesn't have normative effect, and often it's in terms of informing the overall strategy, which then informs which projects are funded, which then informs what happens.
Thank you.
Thank you, Carl. Do we have any questions from the audience? Amanda, Brian, please also feel free to come in if you have any questions or comments before Carl leaves. Sorry, Daniela, just saw your hand. Please go ahead.
Thank you. So I'm still structuring my thoughts a bit. So what I was thinking about is that the examples that you presented are actually ways in which international law can be helpful with respect to environmental peace building. But of course, we also know examples where international law can actually also be counterproductive. So the most obvious example is, of course, when it relates to investments, and then the tensions that arise with, for example, land restitution programs. But we can also think about particular environmental protection measures and how that can maybe also impose problems with addressing local needs. So what about international law as this perhaps not so helpful force? What are your thoughts on that?
This is one of the difficulties. First of all, I agree. This is one of the difficulties when you have an integrated view of international law. So there are, our societies have a lot of tensions between development and preservation, between rights to believe certain things, but then also dignity of everyone, even if one's religious beliefs are bigoted or gender biased. So there are a lot of these sorts of tensions that we have to manage as a society. I think that the investment side is very important to be aware of, because there are profound pressures on these countries to find revenue streams quickly. Immediately after conflict, there's a lot of money. That money will dry up in a few years. And then how does the government operate? And so there's a lot of pressure to open up lands for timber concessions, for mining, for agricultural concessions. And not just to have it be locally owned, but to have international development. And this often happens on lands that are owned by communities under customary tenure. So they're not in the cadastres, they're not on the books. And this leads to land grabbing, it leads to dispossession. I haven't seen a lot of violent problems associated with this yet, but you can look down the road. Sierra Leone, about 80% of the country is under some sort of mineral concession, and more than 10% is under some sort of agricultural concession. Where is everyone going to live? Who's going to have water? Is the water going to be clean? It's not yet a huge problem, but it's not hard to imagine that you're setting up a very problematic future. And these are protected under international investment agreements. So I think part of this is thinking about a lot of these dynamics in a more integrated way. The Liberia Forest Initiative is a great example of this. Liberia has great tracts of the Upper Guinea forest. It's important for economic development, it's important for communities, it's important for conservation, it's important for climate change. And instead of addressing it piecemeal, you had the Liberia Forest Initiative where all the different actors were at the table talking about how do we reform forest management in Liberia? And you're able to have a more holistic approach there. And I think that we need more of these polls, where people come together from multiple perspectives, invoking multiple bodies of law. But huge issue. I'm glad you brought it up, Danielle. I need to. Yeah. I really need to run. This is. I'm so sorry to leave. This is a delightful group, and I'm really. This is a great project, and I hope to hear more about it in the future.
Thanks so much for joining us, Carl. We'll be in touch definitely. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Yes, so we can continue with the second talk of today. Brian, and the floor is yours. Brian is going to talk about food security and the conflict and peace dimensions of that. Thank you, Brian.
Thanks a lot, and thanks for having me here and giving the opportunity to speak to everyone. As you mentioned, I'll talk about hunger around the world today and food security, in particular how WFP, the World Food Program, is responding and what are our priorities today, what are our concerns today. So I'll try to just take you sort of at a very, very high level and then get down into some of the operational issues and then speak a little bit about contributions to peace and how do we see this going forward. So around the world today, the number of people that are food insecure, so people that don't have a regular supply of food or are uncertain about that, is at about 887 million people. And that number is up from just a couple of years ago, 688 million people at the end of 2019. So the numbers have grown considerably due to a number of factors, and we can get into that. But you have that number in front of you, and at the same time, there's wide recognition that the modern capacity for food production, for food distribution, for logistics to get it to where it needs to go, vastly outweigh or outscore the amount of hunger that's around the world today. So we have enough food and we have the means to get it to people, and yet here we have these numbers. Then you also take into consideration that in 2015 we had the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, where number 2 is zero hunger by 2030. So again, global commitment, governments are behind it. Everyone wants to reach this zero hunger, and yet here we are with nearly 1 billion people that are pretty far away from being able to meet their needs. So this is the contradiction we're living with as the World Food Program. One of the biggest drivers of food insecurity is conflict. It's probably over half of that number are living in countries that are in the midst of conflict, or living with protracted conflict, or having severe insecurity, which is either affecting the way that they can access food, or is compelling them to seek humanitarian assistance through organizations like WFP. And in fact, we've got a number of populations around the world that are actually in famine conditions. And this is fairly extraordinary. We had the 4 famines. I don't know if anyone recalls, there were 4 famines in 2018, where we had Somalia, I can remember them all, South Sudan, Yemen, and I think it was Nigeria at the time as well. And we responded fairly effectively at that time. But we're back into it again. And we've got 4 or 5 potential famines looming around the world today in a number of contexts. So the situation's not good. It's very much something that is obviously driven by a number of factors, but conflict does remain as a major concern. The average length of these conflicts or protracted crises today is around 9 years. It's probably going up 10 years since we were last looking at that. So you do have protracted conflict as also a significant driver of that. In addition, we've got obviously economic concerns, particularly coming out of the pandemic, COVID-19, and the impact that that had on countries with both their ability to import food or to produce food and to get that out to populations. And then equally, you do have, and linking it to our previous speaker, climate or natural disasters that are driving considerable amount of hunger as well. As we get into the conflict affected populations, not only are we seeing conflict as a driver, but we're seeing the deliberate use of starvation as a method of war much more prominently than we have probably for the past 30, 40 decades. If you think just simply about the Syria conflict, where they did have these besiegement, they besieged towns. And in those cases, we would have to resort to providing assistance by airdrop. And these are very expensive operations. They are limited in their capacity to actually feed a large number of people, but it's the only way you can actually get to these populations. And so that fact and those occurrences of that have escalated around the world, and we're seeing that use of besiegement or limitations in forcing populations to really concede or come around to whoever might be responsible for that. So I think that's another element. Maybe if I turn then quickly to a few specific examples of where we're operating and where we're increasingly concerned. Afghanistan is probably one of our biggest concerns on the current, given the protracted nature of what's happened in Afghanistan over the years, but then now with the troop withdrawal, and that's on top of a drought that's been going on for a number of years. So you have heightened tensions over the troop withdrawal, the peace agreements, but then drought is affecting populations and they're not able to get out to their fields and get the kind of food that they would need. So the numbers right now, you have about 16.9 million people in crisis level food insecurity in Afghanistan. And when I say crisis, they're probably getting 1 meal a day at best, and they perhaps don't have a regular supply of food. Amongst them, there's about 5.5 million that are on the verge of dropping into a famine-like condition. They're not there yet, but one little thing, a bad winter, an earthquake, further conflict is going to put them over the edge. And that's where we are planning and trying to make sure that we're able to operate at scale in that kind of a context. The lean season in Afghanistan is between March and May, so it's now. We're just coming out of it, but that's when you're seeing these highest levels of hunger in Afghanistan. Another one I'll highlight is Ethiopia. I was deployed there just recently, so I know it quite well. We're scaling up our operations in Tigray in the north of the country, where we've seen conflict erupt at the end of last year and has just become protracted. We had Eritrean forces enter the region, and they're not leaving despite assurances that they would. Plus, we've got other conflicts coming into the region from other parts of Ethiopia. So within the Tigray region, of the population that pre-existed the conflict of about 5.7, it's estimated that 5.2 million people need humanitarian assistance now. So it's over 91% of the population. Of those, 3.6 million are people that are remaining in their locations and most likely hosting populations that are forced from other locations. It's about 600,000 internally displaced, mainly from the west of the country, that have now been pushed into the center part of the country, and a lingering smaller population of refugees from Sudan and from Eritrea. The numbers we expect to be adjusted in the coming weeks. There's a current assessment going on, which is probably going to give us better data on exactly what is the situation of most, but we expect it to turn worse. Despite efforts, we've scaled up operations, NGOs have scaled up operations in the region, but access is a huge constraint. In this case, they're not necessarily targeting humanitarian workers, but when a conflict does break out between the Ethiopians and the TPLF or others, we don't have access. And so large parts of the population have not received food for up to 5-6 months. And we have no visibility on them. We have no capacity to monitor their situation. So that we expect to be a fairly dramatic turn when we get better information on the ground. The government obviously is part of the conflict. We're reliant on them for import of both our communications equipment, our security equipment, and as well as food. And I think you can probably assume that there are tensions there that further complicate the way that we're able to operate. Another one that I'll mention that also is a big concern is Northeast Nigeria. We've had recent assessments which are telling us that in the Northeast, so this is up in the Borno and Adamawa and Yobe states up in the Northeast, there's about 4.4 million people that are in crisis level food insecurity. Overall, in that area, there's 8.7 million people that remain in need of humanitarian assistance. So those numbers are only going up as well. What we're doing is we're trying to monitor the risk of famine in a more detailed way. Here you have a longer term situation where we have a bit more visibility on what's happening on the ground. But what we're seeing is that as we're starting to hit the lean season now, we're going to probably see a further deterioration, particularly in areas that we haven't had access for quite a while. NGOs have had limited access. Some have been kicked out of the country because of statements that they've made. And there are places which just, it's sporadic at best that we have that sort of access. In addition to that, and related again to our previous speaker, we do have concerns about the environment. There's expected to be heavy rains, and we expect there to be heavy flooding that's going to affect further people. So those are some of the conflict highlights, I would say, countries that, there's others obviously, but those just kind of give you a flavor for where we're concerned and how we see the situation evolving. In addition to that, we've got a bit of an outlier, but one that is equally concerning is Madagascar. In southern Madagascar, we've got famine conditions that are affecting over 100,000 people. They're eating leaves, they're eating cactus, they're eating whatever they can find. This isn't a conflict. This is just a situation where they have not received the support they need. Drought has been a big factor for quite some time. It's difficult to reach. It's a big island. It's hard to get the food where it's needed. But the fact of the matter is they're in famine-like conditions now. And this is, despite, in principle, we should be able to reach them and bring the assistance that they need. So that's one where you don't have conflict and still you're having those sorts of conditions affecting people. Now, a few words, I think, linking it a little bit to the legal focus here. In 2018, in May, you had the Security Council adopting Resolution 2417. And this was a resolution that I must admit, it took us a bit by surprise that there was consensus in the council that they recognized that there is a direct link between food and conflict and peace and security. It was a welcome development clearly, and one that really sort of paves the way to us emphasizing this underlying risk of conflict and how that induces hunger amongst populations. Now, the question then becomes, how do you implement the resolution? And the resolution itself has means of reporting, which are very much what we would like to build on. And we have provided informal reports to the council in a number of situations. In only 2 instances, as far as I'm aware, has the council actually reacted to those. One was in South Sudan, and one was in Yemen, where they called for ceasefires based on that reporting. So the resolution itself is useful as a mechanism, I think, to bring greater accountability and visibility, but I think we have to really investigate what does it look like in terms of implementation. And then maybe just a couple of words, I know I'm running a bit long perhaps, on peace. So we instituted a study with SIPRI, which is the Swedish Institute for Peace, on what WFP was able to do to promote peace through its interventions on food security. And they looked at a number of situations. One was the border with Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, El Salvador and the dry corridor. And in both of those, they found very distinct links between the efforts we were using food as a way to promote people to bring water into those communities that were affected by conflict. So basically, using food for work and allowing those communities to then give time to focus on building the channels that would bring in water to those communities. And we found a distinct link then to diminishing the need for conflict or diminishing the tensions between communities. In Liberia, in the post-conflict period in Liberia, as people were returning to the country, we focused our efforts on purchasing food locally so that we could build up the capacity of the local farmers to reestablish themselves, but then also be welcomed by the communities where they were returning, where perhaps there were some tensions with those communities that they had left. So by promoting their active engagement in agriculture, their active engagement in reestablishing markets, diversifying the foods that were available to people, that helped lessen the possibility for conflict. And in fact, we didn't see a resumption of conflict there. Similarly, in Bangladesh, in Cox's Bazar, as we saw Rohingya refugees come into Bangladesh and really overwhelm local communities and local capacities, our injection of bringing farming implements and seeds and food into that helped diminish the conflict that potentially was going to take place between those communities. So we found those very concrete examples where our interventions with food security had diminished that possibility for conflict. One thing that wasn't found yet, one thing that we argue is that hunger and food can cause conflict. There are some evidence that probably can happen, but it's not as clear as conflict versus hunger. So I think it's something we have to carefully weigh and consider as we intervene in these situations. So I'll stop there. I hope I covered a lot of issues, but happy to take more questions.
Thank you very much, Brian, for the rich examples. It's a grim picture, obviously, in terms of the humanitarian needs on the ground, but thank you also for talking about some of the legal initiatives and some of your peace-oriented work. If it's okay, we'll just continue with Amanda's presentation and then take questions at the end. Amanda will talk about the role of economic, social, and cultural rights in peace building. So it's going to, I think, bring everything together in a way. Amanda, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay? My connection's a bit. Okay, thank you very much. And it's moving, I guess, to a different level again, and back to a more theoretical approach after those really rich examples. So, but I'm going to talk in particular about the role of international human rights law and explore how the protection of economic, social, and cultural rights can be approached during and in the aftermath of armed conflicts to lay the foundations for sustainable peace and development. So my talk really is, I'm going to structure it around 3 hows and 2 whys. So I just wanted to start really, before thinking about the how of international law, about why it's important to consider economic, social, and cultural rights. And obviously we know that these kinds of violations can be a consequence of conflict, and also that they can constitute gross and systematic human rights violations, as we've heard already from our speakers. But I think it's also important to acknowledge that lack of enjoyment or violations of economic and social rights can also act as underlying grievances, as root causes, or indeed drivers of conflict. So I think it's important to think about those underlying issues as well as the more overt, direct violations through direct violence. And coupled with civil and political rights violations, repression, or, for example, sudden changes to access to resources, denial of these rights can act as a trigger which tips over into conflict. So, but I think, as Carl pointed out earlier, when he was talking about environmental peace building, economic, social, and cultural rights are also part of efforts to transform conflict to peace. So it's not just about how they're affected, but it's also about how they can be part of a transformative process. I've forgotten to share my slides. Is that all right if I share my slides? Sorry, too busy talking. Okay. Okay. So the first how that I want to talk about is really looking and recapping a little bit on what Carl said actually about the role of international law in the protection of economic, social, and cultural rights during a conflict. And of course, we know that these rights are protected under international humanitarian law, but also under international human rights law. And we know that, for example, the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights does apply during war and occupation, as well as in peacetime. And this has been confirmed by a number of legal bodies, including UN treaty bodies, and of course by the International Court of Justice in their 2004 Wall opinion. And another issue I think is very important to point out is that there are no derogations. There is no derogations clause in the International Covenant, and there is a limitations clause, which is Article 4 of ICESCA, but that only permits limitations outside of the minimum core of economic, social, and cultural rights. So that means the fundamental minimum threshold of rights, such as the right to food, the right to housing, and the right to water, cannot be limited even in times of armed conflict. We also know, of course, that economic, social, and cultural rights are protected through a number of relevant international humanitarian law rules for protected groups, including civilians. So, for example, Common Article 3 of the Geneva Conventions, or just one example, there are many I could list, but Article 55 of the Geneva Convention 4, which deals with the obligation of an occupying state to provide food and medical supplies. Similarly, we know that the humanitarian aid plays an absolutely crucial role during conflict, and obviously this is supports, you know, food, water, etc. Although we don't talk about binding rules, we do know that there's the sphere, voluntary principles and charter for humanitarian organisations. So we have, I think, as Carl pointed out earlier as well already, many frameworks which are applicable in international law for the protection of these rights. But in reality, we know, of course, that many of these rights are threatened or indeed violated in situations of armed conflict. So the question is not just how we protect these rights during conflict, but also how international law and economic, social and cultural rights can be utilised to address the violations that do take place and to prevent further conflict and build inclusive, sustainable peace. So the next point that I want to focus on is the role of international law in remedying economic, social and cultural rights in terms of conflict-related violations. And very much the law's approach has been one which has been dominated by transitional justice. And this, of course, is focused very much on remedying gross and systematic violations, both under international criminal law or perhaps under more restorative mechanisms such as truth and reconciliation commissions. But it's also true to say that these types of mechanisms and transitional justice as a field has focused predominantly on violations of civil and political rights and has marginalised economic, social and cultural rights and indeed broader economic crimes from within these processes. Now, there have been since, I suppose, 2012, particularly in the last few years, moves to try and change that. We have seen a wealth of academic literature around that, and we have seen some developments in terms of practice. We know that under Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, for example, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Timor-Leste had a mandate to explore violations of economic, social and cultural rights and did so, and found that in fact many people had suffered extensive violations of the rights to food and water, health, housing and education, and that the deliberate policy of forced displacement had led to famine, hunger and deprivation, and for many death caused by famine and famine-related disease. So we did see some progress in terms of transitional justice process here, but what we didn't see was reparations for those violations. Under international criminal law, we have seen increasingly, and again, I think this has already been mentioned, indictments around pillage and plunder, and starvation as a weapon of war, again, has been mentioned, blockades. So this, again, is something that it's now being brought to the forefront more clearly in international criminal law. But I think there's a lot more scope to be developed around, particularly the law around pillage. So it's not just about property, but also natural resources. Reparations are another mechanism that deal sometimes with economic social rights violations, guarantees of non-repetition, and of course local transitional justice, which I know we've touched on and we can come back to in the discussion, I think. So outside of transitional justice, we also have human rights mechanisms that exist, and I think we need to think more about how we strengthen and use the existing human rights mechanisms that we have for dealing with conflict-related violations of economic, social and cultural rights. And you know, I can come back to that later if people are interested with a bit more detail. Okay. So the next how that I want to focus on is the role of international law and economic, social and cultural rights in laying the foundations for peace and development. So thinking about peace building. And here this is the work I'm currently working on at the moment in my forthcoming monograph, which is about thinking about economic, social and cultural rights in terms of conflict prevention and early warning. And we know that there's been some progress made with the Office of the High Commission for Human Rights, very much looking at early warning mechanisms, but also the incorporation of economic, social and cultural rights in peace agreements, in post-conflict peace building, and also thinking about constitutional provisions, bills of rights, the establishment of national human rights institutions, and post-conflict development and reconstruction as well. So thinking about how an existing human rights framework can assist with the prioritization of resources, with the rights-based approach to development, with the provision of basic services, and ensuring access for the most vulnerable. So I want to come back to the why. So why are they key to laying foundations for building sustainable peace and development? Well, I think as we've seen, there's been some gaps in human rights protections as regards transitional justice and peace building. And I think economic and social and cultural rights need to be addressed if we're going to have effective peace building. And they often address local priorities for peace around basic needs, basic rights, housing, food, water, work, education. So we need to think about them as tackling the priorities of those on the ground and being responsive to local needs. But as I mentioned earlier, I think it's also about addressing the direct violence that we see in conflict-affected settings, but also underlying structural injustices and root causes of conflict. And we need to address these if we're going to work towards longer-term sustainable peace. Economic, social, cultural rights are inextricably linked to the environment, as we've heard. So issues of land grabbing, land pollution, destruction of crops and food, poisoning or pollution of water sources. These are all linked to the enjoyment of the rights to an adequate standard of living, to health, to education. And you clearly see this when you look at human rights defenders. In particular, they're often defending environmental rights and economic, social and cultural rights. In terms of the sustainable peace agenda that we saw come out from the Secretary General back in 2015, I think, we need to think about inclusive peace. And this means ensuring the needs of the most vulnerable and the most marginalised are addressed. And a human rights framework, again, can ensure attention to the most vulnerable through its special protections regime. And of course, through human rights-based approach, thinking about principles of equality, non-discrimination, participation, transparency and accountability. The existing economic, social and cultural rights framework also aids with the prioritisation of resources. So if we think about provisions for minimum core obligations, progressive realisation, maximum available resources, the well-developed system around indicators and benchmarks, all of this can help in terms of prioritising what are often scarce resources. And this, of course, brings me to the link with development and to the Sustainable Development Agenda and making these SDG goals a reality. Which, you know, we, as you say, all states have bought into, but looking at the reality on the ground is somewhat different at the moment. So I think I'm slightly over, but I'm just going to finish there. I just want to say, if anybody's interested in the project, the link to the project website is there, or if they're interested in knowing more, they can drop me an email. And thank you for having me today. Looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Amanda. This was a truly comprehensive overview, and I think it really addressed the core idea behind our event. So thank you very much for that. We'll continue the conversation forward. for a bit. I'll hand over to Gigi for that, and then we'll take the questions from the audience. Please feel free to submit them via chat or to raise your virtual hand, as I mentioned before. Over to you, Gigi.
Thank you so much. So as ever, I'll just kickstart with a few questions for both speakers, as previously. So maybe just to put the rights at the center of our discussion, and also maybe a little bit more in relation to what Brian was talking about. So Brian, in your experience as very much being at the forefront of humanitarian work, do you feel that rights, and especially the right to food, has any force, in fact, in talking to donors or in framing access to these territories where otherwise access is very difficult? So I suppose to flip a little bit of what Amanda is saying back to you, do you think rights actually have a role in practice, or is this just something that, you know, we talk about because it makes us feel good? And then I guess the question for Amanda is a similar one, and maybe a bit provocative, is to what extent, and that's something that I often ask myself, we talk about rights because that's what we know as lawyers, but maybe to push a bit more of what's the value of framing the issue of you know, access to these very basic necessities through the language of rights. And I'm sure you get asked this a lot, but it just kept on, it was something that kept on coming through my mind as you were talking. Why can't we talk about injustice? Why can't we talk about colonialism? You know, why do we need rights to be able to articulate some of these issues? So yeah, thank you.
Should I come in first since you raised the question? Yeah, okay. It's a great question, and I think the answer differs depending on who you talk to. As you mentioned, donors in particular, the donors are more than not Western donors that do have a rights-based view on the world, and I think do very much expect that we do respond in humanitarian crises in a very principled way that does take into account those rights that are fundamental. And so I think for them, the dialogue is very relevant on rights. And I think we do have to perhaps think through how do we translate that into what we actually do on the ground effectively. Because what we're doing is responding to crises, emergencies, and often those rights in those contexts on the ground, when you're working with armed actors, aren't as prominent of a discussion. It's more about staying alive. So I think there is a very clear distinction about how you frame your conversations depending on who you talk to. When it comes to access, certainly rights and certainly the role of the United Nations, certainly humanitarian principles come into play as we discuss with armed actors. And you would hope that there is a respect for that role, and certainly independence and impartiality are something that we very much use as we negotiate access to populations. I think we've seen a pretty severe undermining of that respect for the humanitarian principles in many of these crises. The number of humanitarian staff that have been killed over the past 5 to 7 years is considerably higher than what we've seen in the past. And so that level of respect, that risk, I think, that has just increased so much is an indication that those rights are becoming less and less seen as needing to be respected by these armed actors, or in fact, I would say actively undermined in many cases. So it becomes less of a valid argument in their minds, and therefore makes it difficult for us then to access. So that's my short answer, I think, on rights. I think very much appreciate the focus, but it's tough. Yeah.
Shall I go?
Please.
Okay. Thanks. So I agree with Brian has said. Of course, I don't think for one moment that rights is necessarily what somebody in the midst of conflict is going to jump to, but I do think there is value in framing these issues as rights issues. The first reason being that, you know, we know what happens when something is an aim or a policy, you know, or you know, when we think about it, charity perhaps, when we think about providing food and water. And there's nothing empowering about relying on charity. Okay, so when we talk about rights, we're, as human rights lawyers, we're always talking about the fact that these are legal entitlements, and believing that because they're legal entitlements, that's therefore empowering, because it gives people agency to demand those entitlements are met. And along with that comes accountability. So you know, when we think about the human rights framework, we've already got a framework for monitoring progress, for assessing how states are looking after their populations. And, you know, whilst there are a lot of issues in terms of enforcement of international human rights law, and whilst states obviously don't always provide for their populations and rights are violated, I don't think that means we should get rid of a rights-based approach. I think if anything, that as international lawyers, we should be shouting out louder that these are rights. And I think this is, again, another reason why rights are an important lens, if you like, is that they're universal. So there's this universality of international human rights law. And if we think about international law, not just international human rights law, but the very basis of the UN Charter, we're talking about common principles, shared humanity, humankind. And, you know, Francesca Klug, for example, has talked very much about the need to regain that kind of momentum and movement around common principles of humanity. So I think there is the value in seeing these things as rights. I think they can be very useful for advocacy, for example, you know, in terms of local peace builders. They can use international human rights law as an advocacy tool. So I would very much stand my ground and say they have a lot to offer. Thanks.
Thank you, Amanda. We have 3 questions from the audience. Shall we take them all in one go, and then you can address the aspects that you find relevant to yourself? I'm sorry, I don't think this is your name, but it says Skogli. Can you please go ahead, unmute yourself?
Yes, I'm sorry. For some reason, my full name isn't coming up. I'm Sigrun Skogli. I'm Professor of Human Rights Law at Lancaster University. And thank you to, well, all 3 speakers for really interesting presentations this afternoon. And I think they come together really nicely in terms of addressing how we look at conflict prevention and justice. And the one thing I think I would like to ask a little bit about, and I think perhaps my question goes mainly to Brian, because you referred to something at the very end of your presentation about looking at food shortages, famine as a cause of conflict, and that it didn't seem to be a strong cause of conflict as of now. I don't know if that's because we haven't had the capacity to really look at it, or whether it is, or whether that is actually the case. I mean, which it might well be. But I was just thinking about it in terms of the changing conditions that the world is facing at the moment, and the potential for quite massive food shortages as a result of climate change and environmental degradation, and where we might see quite sudden, I mean, I'm sure you see sudden shortages already, but more of the sudden shortages and sort of difficulties in accessing food very, very quickly, and whether that might be whether that might be something that might change the picture, that this can cause conflict on a different level than what we have seen so far.
Thank you very much. Daniela, please go ahead, unmute yourself.
Thank you very much, and thank you also to the speakers for really inspiring presentations. So maybe one observation with respect to Brian's presentation. I was intrigued by the examples that you mentioned, because we lawyers also often, of course, think in terms of IHL and ICL and the prohibition of starvation and the war crime of starvation. But actually your examples show the relativity of that discussion, because I think in most of the examples you mentioned, these are not deliberate attempts to starve the population. And so that's something that struck me when I listened to your presentation. And then a question for Amanda. I've been very inspired by your work, so it's really nice to actually hear you presenting your work here. And I would like to actually take you up on your invitation to elaborate a bit on the role of human rights mechanisms in remedying ESC rights violations. And I'm particularly interested in also questions relating to access to natural resources, because that's something I've been doing quite some research on myself. So I'm really curious about hearing your ideas about that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And we have a final question from Sophie Terry. Sophie, would you like to ask this yourself, or shall I read it? I'll just go ahead and read it. So this is for Brian, again about the prohibition of starvation under the Rome Statute. So Sophie is asking if this could provide new ways to address conflict-related food insecurity, not only by the court, but also unilaterally by states through universal jurisdiction. Maybe we can start with Brian again and then go to Amanda.
Okay, thanks for the great questions. I could probably spend a couple hours here. I'll start with the last one on the 24/17 and the expansion of the ICC mandate. So I think certainly that's a really positive development. Clearly, the extension of the war crime in non-international conflicts, that it gives us, I think, greater confidence, but then knowing that states are very conscious of the fact that that is seen as so important, and to the extent that people can be prosecuted for it, I think that threat in a way is very critical. And yet I don't think we've seen many states sign up to the amendment yet. As far as I understand, there's only been a handful. And so we haven't seen a big take-up of that. Maybe that's for other reasons, but the amendment still is relatively thin in terms of states that have responded to that. But nevertheless, I think the message is clear, and we certainly welcome that. I think one of the challenges, though, around, certainly the ICC has been called into question, particularly across Africa. I think there's been some states that have withdrawn or are threatening to withdraw. So it also ramps up, I think, some of the tensions around the role of the criminal court, and whether or not states will actually respect these kinds of developments. Having said that, again, I think it's the right move, obviously. The other area that I think is in relation to this is, in many of these contexts, you don't see the reach of the state beyond the capital. You see rule of law completely undermined when you get 20 kilometers outside of the capital. The rule of law starts to fall apart, and the means for bringing people to justice or some sort of transitional justice system doesn't exist, or is very severely undermined. So I think we need to take that into consideration as well as we think about what does the law translate into at those levels. I'm a big advocate for taking 24/17 and the principles that behind 24/17 and having a resolution by the African Union that would mirror 24/17. I'm a big advocate for translating that into national legislation, in particular also around the right food, because then you have clear ways of holding people accountable in those contexts. So I think it's a step in the right direction, but it's still fairly broad, and I think the application of it remains to be seen. No one has ever been prosecuted for the crime of starvation, and that remains, I think, a very stark reality. Do you want me to get to the other questions as well, or do we want? Okay. So I think the first question is around this fact that we hadn't really seen strong evidence about the fact of food insecurity creating conflict. There are certain instances. I know in Kenya after the elections, we did see some high food prices, lack of food in markets, lack of food in grocery stores did lead to higher levels of conflict. So there are some examples out there. I don't want to completely say that that's not the case, but nevertheless, it's one that's perhaps a little harder to see at this stage. But I do think what we can say is that when there is high levels of food insecurity, there are multiple layers, I think, that you have to consider that then can trigger conflict. It's those access to those resources, but then it's perhaps people selling their assets and therefore having to go into armed groups, perhaps, to get a source of income or to protect their family. It's them being forced into situations where they don't have the means to keep their children alive or to keep their families together. The other factor, I think, is that you do see more voluntary forced movement of people. We've seen, this is what you're seeing in Europe coming up through Libya from sub-Saharan Africa, is that as resources are diminished for communities and they don't have the means to get by, they pick up and leave and they look for other places where they can survive. And that puts pressure on other communities. It puts pressure on those migration routes. Puts pressure on herders and others that perhaps use those more traditional ways of surviving with more competition on those routes. So I think there's a number of layers that come into play there. And then I think, I wrote down a few notes on the last question, but where we hadn't perhaps seen the same level of deliberate starvation or starvation used as a method of war in the examples that I provided, I think we can point to very specific instances where we're seeing it happening today. Ethiopia is one in Tigray. We very much attribute the hunger to starvation, using very purposely to cut off access to areas that are held by opposition groups. South Sudan, we have famine-like conditions in Pibor County in South Sudan today. That is completely and utterly a tactic of war. The only reason those people are in those conditions are because they are being cut off by the military. Burkina Faso in the north, it's not necessarily a clear one-to-one type of conflict, but the number of different armed groups in that area are purposely using starvation to force people from their homes, to steal their land, or assume control over large parts of the area. And then Yemen is clearly a case where we do see starvation as very purposeful in how the war is being conducted. So there are examples, and sorry, I didn't touch on those explicitly, but they're out there. Thanks.
Thank you, Brian. Please go ahead, Amanda.
Okay. Thanks, Daniela, for your kind words. I don't know. There you are. You moved around the screen. Yeah, I think to expand, of course, we know generally that one of the criticisms that's put forward is always that there is a lack of enforcement of international human rights law, and we don't have a world court. But we do have many mechanisms which I think we could use more effectively and target. So of course we've got the ICC, and I think we've talked about that, but I want to think about really how we could strengthen mechanisms at the regional level. So I think Brian mentioned there about the African Union, but also the African Court, and Commission. Of course, we're up against scarce resources again, question over political will. But we also, and again, I would agree with Brian, need to strengthen constitutional and domestic incorporation of international standards around economic, social and cultural rights. But in terms of the UN mechanisms, I think back, I think it was 2018, if I remember rightly, we had a session with the UN Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights on sustaining peace and economic, social and cultural rights in the Covenant. And it was clear then that, you know, there is the will to try and do more, to think about how, coming back to Carl's point, we have a much more integrated approach. So one of the ideas that I put to them was that perhaps we should have a standing recommendation in the concluding observations, as they do now for the Sustainable Development Goals, that perhaps we should have a similar standing recommendation on sustaining peace in concluding observations. I also think we could think about the committee having an urgent action or early warning procedure. We could also think about a general comment on economic, social, cultural rights and peace building. So all of this would start to make peace building and conflict related violations, I think, much more visible in the system. And then, of course, we've got the optional protocol, which we know is in its infancy still, but that's another mechanism that could be used to deal with conflict-related violations. And perhaps a special rapporteur under the Human Rights Council, special procedures on human rights and peace building, or human rights and conflict, I think would be a really good start in terms of strengthening mechanisms. Does that answer your question? Thanks.
Thank you very much, Amanda. I still have questions for Brian and you, but I'm mindful that we are running over significantly, so I'll leave them for another conversation. I'll just thank you all for your participation. Thanks firstly to Brian, Amanda and Carl for your time, for joining us today. These were really helpful, I'm sure, to the audience, but also to us and in this project team. Thank you to Guidre for joining me in moderating this event. Thanks to Eloise and Alex, our center's administrator, for their help in organizing. And thanks to you all for joining us today. I hope to continue the conversation in the future.
Thanks a lot. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.